Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss stories that matter. Stories that go deeper than headlines and stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Valerie Bertinelli didn't wake up one morning and decide to rewrite history. When she finally spoke, it was because silence had become heavier than grief. For years, she carried memories of Eddie Van Halen that were too layered to explain and too painful to revisit. Love, disappointment, loyalty, and loss all lived side by side inside her. She wasn't trying to change how the world saw Eddie. She was trying to survive her own truth. Time has a strange way of doing that. It strips away denial and forces honesty. And when Valerie finally opened up, she did so not as a celebrity or an ex-wife, but as a woman who had loved deeply and lost something that never truly left her heart. From the outside, Valerie and Eddie's story looked like a classic rise-and-fall Hollywood romance. They married young in 1981, surrounded by fame, music, and dreams that felt unstoppable. Together, they built a family, welcomed their son Wolfie, and tried to balance love with the chaos of Eddie's stardom. But fame amplifies everything, including flaws. Addiction, pressure, and betrayal slowly eroded what once felt unbreakable. By the time they separated in 2002, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Their divorce became final in 2007, and the public assumed that chapter had closed for good. What no one realized was that this ending was actually the beginning of a different kind of bond. When Valerie recently reflected on those years, she made something very clear. The end of their marriage didn't mean the end of their connection. Instead of lawyers and courtroom drama, they chose mediation. Their priority wasn't revenge or control. It was Wolfie. They wanted to protect their son from the emotional wreckage that so often follows celebrity divorces. Eddie even helped Valerie choose her new home, carefully making sure it was close enough for Wolfie to move easily between them. It wasn't a typical arrangement, but it reflected the care they still had for one another. Beneath the hurt, there was still respect, and beneath the disappointment, there was still love. Valerie has never denied that anger existed in the early days after their separation. There was pain, resentment, and grief for the future she thought they would share. Dreams don't disappear quietly. They fight back before fading. But over time, something unexpected happened. The anger softened. The bitterness lost its grip. What remained was an honest friendship built on years of shared history. They talked often, spent time together, and learned how to exist in each other's lives without the weight of marriage. It wasn't easy, but it was real. Valerie came to understand that love doesn't always end. Sometimes it just changes its shape. As Eddie's struggles with addiction and health continued, Valerie found herself drawn back into his life in ways she hadn't planned. She knew him better than almost anyone else. She understood his fears, his guilt, and the parts of him he kept hidden from the world. Even after the divorce, their relationship kept evolving. At one point, they even lived together again for a period. They leaned on each other, supported each other, and stayed connected in a way that defied labels. It wasn't about romance anymore. It was about loyalty, history, and a bond that refused to disappear simply because paperwork said it should. When Eddie remarried in 2009, Valerie respected the boundaries of his new life. She stepped back and allowed him space to build something different with Janie Lisiewski. For years, Valerie stayed quiet, never inserting herself into narratives that weren't hers to tell. But as she later revealed, the reality of Eddie's final years was more complicated than anyone knew. Janie had quietly moved out a few years before Eddie's death. Valerie didn't share this to assign blame or stir controversy. She spoke with compassion, acknowledging that relationships are rarely simple, especially under the weight of illness and time. Even after moving out, Janie was still present during Eddie's final moments. Valerie made it clear that love doesn't vanish just because circumstances change. What surprised many people was how Valerie described her own connection to Eddie during that same period. They were divorced. They lived separate lives. Yet emotionally, neither of them ever fully walked away. They talked often, sometimes about Wolfie, sometimes about memories, sometimes about nothing important at all. As Eddie's health declined, Valerie found herself pulled closer, becoming someone he trusted deeply when fear and vulnerability took over. Eddie's battle with cancer stretched over many years, beginning with tongue cancer in the early 2000s and later progressing to stage 4 lung cancer in 2017. Each diagnosis chipped away at the illusion of time. Valerie wasn't just an ex-wife watching from a distance. Privately, she became a steady presence, someone Eddie could be honest with without pretending to be strong. She understood him without explanation. She knew when to speak and when silence mattered more. Their relationship no longer fit a traditional definition. It was part friendship, part family, part unfinished love, and entirely human. As 2020 approached, Valerie sensed that something was changing. The phone calls became more frequent. Eddie's voice grew weaker. Hospital stays became longer and more urgent. Wolfie shared updates that carried an unspoken fear. Valerie later admitted she wasn't prepared for what was coming. No matter how much you tell yourself you've moved on, loss has a way of pulling you back to places you thought you'd already survived. In those final weeks, the past and present blurred together, and all the careful emotional boundaries she had built quietly collapsed. Valerie and Wolfie spent long hours at Eddie's hospital bed. They brought small comforts, favorite foods, familiar jokes, and gentle conversations meant to make things feel normal. Pizza, burritos, snacks that reminded him of home. There were no dramatic speeches, no grand declarations, just ordinary moments filled with extraordinary weight. In the face of death, those simple gestures became everything. They were reminders of a life once shared, of laughter and routine, of love that didn't need words to exist. Even as his body weakened, Eddie remained emotionally open with Valerie. He had always shown her parts of himself the world never saw. In his final hours, that vulnerability returned. Valerie described leaning close, holding his hand, listening carefully as his words grew softer. The machines hummed in the background, marking time in a way that felt cruel and mechanical. Then Eddie whispered words that would stay with her forever. "I love you," she said it back without hesitation. Divorce had ended their marriage, but it had never ended that truth. When Eddie took his final breath on October 6, 2020, Valerie felt something inside her collapse. She wasn't his wife anymore. She wasn't his partner in life. But she was someone who had loved him before the fame, before the chaos, before the illness. In that moment, titles didn't matter. What mattered was presence. What mattered was that they were together, just as they had been at the most important crossroads of their lives. After Eddie's death, the world celebrated his legacy as one of the greatest guitarists of all time. Tributes poured in. Headlines focused on music and influence. Behind the scenes, Valerie was unraveling. Her grief didn't fit neatly into categories. She wasn't a widow in the legal sense, yet she mourned like one. She struggled to understand where she fit in a world that expected her to have moved on years ago. For a long time, she kept that pain private, determined to stay strong for Wolfie. The moment her emotional walls broke came unexpectedly while watching Behind the Music, where Wolfie spoke about his father. Valerie tried to support her son by watching, but the memories became unbearable. She had to stop the episode repeatedly. It wasn't just seeing Eddie on screen. It was hearing Wolfie's voice, feeling his pain, and realizing how deeply their family story was being reopened. Grief doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it ambushes you when you think you're ready. Soon after, Valerie shared a deeply personal message on Instagram. She admitted something she had avoided for years. Eddie wasn't her soulmate. She once believed he was, but time and healing forced her to confront a harder truth. Addiction, infidelity, and fame damaged their marriage in ways love alone couldn't fix. This wasn't about diminishing Eddie. It was about honesty. She acknowledged that she had cast herself in the role of a grieving widow, even while knowing logically that she wasn't one. The heart doesn't follow logic. Valerie's grief was complicated and layered. Losing Eddie meant losing a piece of her past that shaped her adulthood and motherhood. It meant letting go of who she once was and accepting that some losses hurt no matter how much time has passed. Her pain was human, messy, and real. It didn't need justification. It needed acknowledgement. While Valerie processed her grief, Wolfie carried a burden of his own. Being Eddie Van Halen's only child meant inheriting a legacy that millions worshipped. It also meant facing pressure no teenager should ever endure. Wolfie joined Van Halen at just 15, not for fame, but because his father needed him. Eddie was struggling emotionally and physically, and Wolfie felt staying close was the only way to help keep him grounded. The public didn't see that. They saw nepotism. they saw criticism. Some fans blamed Wolfie for replacing Michael Anthony. Others questioned his talent. For a teenager already worried about his father's health, the cruelty was overwhelming. Inside the band, tension never fully eased. Even moments that should have felt triumphant were clouded by conflict. Yet Wolfie stayed, driven by love rather than ego. As Eddie's cancer returned in 2017, doctors gave him weeks to live. Treatments in Germany bought him nearly 3 more years. Years Wolfie treasured deeply. When Eddie died, Wolfie was the one who announced it to the world. His grief became public instantly. But the real pain came later, in silence, in memories, and in the music he could no longer share with his father. Wolfie's song Distance, originally written to be played for Eddie, became a farewell. Every performance reopens the wound. Honoring his father's legacy became both an honor and a burden. Online harassment, unfair comparisons, and depression followed. Valerie watched her son fight battles no one should face alone, and their shared grief bound them even closer. In the years since Eddie's passing, Valerie has slowly begun healing. Not by forgetting, but by understanding. Through therapy and writing, she confronted guilt, regret, and the question of whether she could have done more. Over time, she accepted that life doesn't unfold neatly. Their marriage ended because it had to, not because it was meaningless. Their connection continued because it was real. Valerie realized that Eddie's presence shaped her long after he was gone. His vulnerability, his final words, and his love for Wolfie stayed with her. They forced her to reevaluate her own life and the emotional walls she had built. Healing, she learned, meant honoring the whole story, not just the parts that were easy to remember. Today, Valerie speaks with clarity and empathy. She understands that love can change shape without disappearing. Eddie's greatest legacy wasn't just his music. It was their son, proof that something beautiful survived the chaos. Their story didn't end. It evolved into something quieter, softer, and eternal, and that truth continues to live on.